She said my house would never truly be ours until both our names were on the deed, despite the prenup she'd signed willingly. What started as reasonable requests slowly revealed something much deeper about family loyalty versus marriage boundaries. I'm a 37-year-old structural engineer in suburban Tampa, and I've spent 15 years building what most people would call a stable life. My ranch home sits on a quiet street where neighbors still wave to each other, paid off completely after years of disciplined saving and strategic career moves that took me from junior draftsman to senior project manager. Growing up, I watched my father lose half his construction business to a messy partnership dissolution when his longtime business partner's divorce attorney argued that company assets were marital property. That cautionary tale shaped every financial decision I've made since, teaching me the importance of clear legal boundaries and asset protection. I avoid unnecessary debt, maintain emergency funds equivalent to 8 months of expenses, and believe firmly in protecting what you've worked to build through careful planning and legal documentation. My daily routine revolved around precision and methodical execution, whether I was reviewing structural load calculations for a new commercial development or maintaining my property's immaculate landscaping during weekend maintenance sessions. The house itself represented years of careful investment and personal labor, from the custom kitchen cabinets I'd installed during a 6-month renovation project to the energy-efficient HVAC system I'd researched extensively before purchasing. Every square foot reflected deliberate choices made with long-term value and functionality in mind. Meeting Samantha felt like discovering something I hadn't realized was missing from my carefully ordered world. She was working as a hotel operations manager when we crossed paths at a construction industry expo in Orlando, where she was coordinating vendor relationships for a major resort renovation project involving multiple contractors and complex logistics. Her energy was infectious and completely different from my methodical approach to everything, bringing a dynamic spontaneity that somehow made my structured life feel more alive. Where I planned extensively before making any significant decision, she moved with intuitive confidence that somehow always seemed to work out in her favor. Our conversations flowed naturally from professional topics about project management challenges to personal dreams about travel and future goals, and I found myself genuinely laughing and relaxing for the first time in months. She had endless stories about managing demanding guests during peak season rushes and navigating impossible deadlines with vendors who seemed determined to complicate every simple request, making my engineering challenges seem straightforward by comparison. Her ability to find humor in stressful situations and maintain optimism despite constant workplace drama was refreshing after years of dating women who seemed overwhelmed by minor inconveniences. Within 3 months, we were spending most weekends together, either at my place where she'd help with yard work and home projects, or exploring Tampa's downtown district and discovering restaurants and entertainment venues I'd never bothered to investigate on my own. I appreciated how she respected my space and established routines without trying to immediately rearrange everything to suit her preferences, understanding that my organization systems had developed over years of living independently. She seemed genuinely impressed by the home I'd built and maintained, often commenting on specific details like the crown molding I'd installed myself using traditional techniques or the way I'd landscaped the backyard to maximize both privacy and natural light while maintaining low-maintenance native plantings. Her enthusiasm for home improvement projects and willingness to learn about electrical and plumbing basics made her an ideal partner for someone who took pride in maintaining and upgrading his property. After a year of dating, she mentioned casually that her lease was ending and how expensive rent had become in her complex, with management implementing annual increases that were pricing out long-time tenants. Moving in together felt like a natural progression rather than a dramatic relationship milestone, and I offered my spare bedroom as temporary space while she figured out her next living situation. That temporary arrangement quickly became permanent as we fell into domestic rhythms that felt surprisingly comfortable and natural. She contributed fairly to groceries and utilities without my having to ask or calculate exact amounts, and her organizational skills actually improved some of my existing systems around the house, particularly in the kitchen and laundry areas where she implemented efficiency improvements I hadn't considered. Marriage came up organically during our second year together when friends started asking about our long-term plans, and we both approached the topic practically rather than getting caught up in romantic fantasies about perfect weddings or fairy tale futures. I insisted on a prenuptial agreement to protect the assets I'd accumulated before our relationship, including the house and my retirement accounts, and she signed without hesitation or objection, saying she understood completely given what I'd told her about my father's business experience and the importance of legal clarity in financial matters. The wedding was simple but meaningful, held in my backyard under string lights I'd installed specifically for the occasion, with close friends and immediate family attending a ceremony that focused on commitment rather than expensive pageantry. For the first year of marriage, everything functioned smoothly with our agreed-upon financial arrangements where we maintained separate accounts for personal expenses while sharing household costs through a joint account we both contributed to based on our respective incomes. However, Samantha's family dynamics began revealing complexities I hadn't fully understood during our courtship period when interactions with her relatives were limited to holiday gatherings and brief phone conversations. Her sister Diana seemed to cycle through jobs and romantic relationships with concerning frequency, never maintaining stable employment for more than 8 months before finding reasons to quit or getting terminated for attendance issues. Their mother Catherine had a documented pattern of launching ambitious business ventures that invariably failed within months due to poor planning, unrealistic expectations, and inability to manage basic financial responsibilities. I started noticing how often Samantha's evening phone conversations with family members involved detailed discussions about money problems, various emergencies, and requests for temporary assistance that somehow never seemed to result in lasting improvements to their situations. Diana had 3 children from different relationships and lived in subsidized housing that she constantly complained about while making no apparent effort to improve her circumstances or increase her income through education or skill development. Catherine rented a small studio apartment that consumed most of her sporadic income from various part-time positions she'd obtain and lose with predictable regularity. These ongoing family obligations were beginning to create subtle but persistent tensions in our household as Samantha fielded increasingly frequent calls for financial help, though I convinced myself initially that supporting extended family during difficult times was simply part of being married to someone with strong family bonds and a generous heart. The prenuptial agreement I'd insisted on protected my premarital assets while establishing clear boundaries around financial responsibility, but Samantha's family proved increasingly skilled at creating emergencies that demanded immediate intervention. Diana's employment history read like a case study in job instability, cycling through positions at retail stores, restaurants, and call centers with predictable patterns of initial enthusiasm followed by conflicts with management or sudden health issues that conveniently coincided with performance reviews. Her 3 children, ranging in age from 4 to 12, lived in a constant state of chaos that Diana seemed to view as normal rather than problematic, missing school for various minor illnesses and family crises while she struggled to maintain basic household routines that most single parents manage successfully. The subsidized housing complex where they lived was undoubtedly challenging with outdated facilities and difficult neighbors, but Diana's complaints focused primarily on superficial issues like appliance malfunctions and thin walls rather than taking advantage of available community resources like job training programs, childcare assistance, or budgeting counseling that might actually improve their long-term situation. Each employment termination brought a predictable cascade of financial emergencies involving late rent payments, utility shutoff notices, or car troubles that threatened her ability to find new work, creating a perpetual cycle where Samantha felt morally obligated to provide temporary assistance that somehow never resulted in lasting stability or meaningful progress toward independence. Catherine's business ventures followed an equally predictable pattern of unrealistic optimism followed by spectacular failure and blame displacement, from a home-based catering service that folded when she realized the health department required actual permits and food safety training she'd never bothered to research, to a multi-level marketing scheme selling essential oils that cost her more in startup fees and product inventory than she ever recovered in actual sales to real customers. Her studio apartment in a converted motel complex consumed nearly 70% of her sporadic income from part-time work at various retail establishments, leaving virtually nothing for emergencies, vehicle maintenance, or basic necessities that most adults budget for automatically. The apartment itself was barely adequate, with a kitchenette consisting of a microwave and mini refrigerator, a bathroom that shared plumbing with adjacent units, and windows that faced a parking lot where residents stored broken-down vehicles they couldn't afford to repair or remove. I discovered the full extent of Samantha's financial support for her mother during our third month of marriage while conducting my monthly budget analysis, a routine practice I'd maintained since college to track spending patterns and identify potential issues before they became serious problems affecting our long-term financial goals. Among the usual household expenses like groceries, utilities, and maintenance costs, I found a recurring monthly charge of $450 to something called Pacific Property Management, which investigation revealed was Catherine's apartment complex receiving electronic rent payments from our joint account without any prior discussion or agreement. When I asked Samantha about this unexpected and significant expense that represented nearly 15% of our monthly housing budget, she initially deflected with vague explanations about temporary help during a particularly difficult period, but eventually admitted under direct questioning that she'd been covering her mother's rent shortfall for the past 8 months without mentioning it to me or including it in our household budget discussions. The revelation that I'd been unknowingly subsidizing Catherine's housing while she made no apparent effort to increase her income, find more affordable living arrangements, or access available social services triggered our first serious argument about financial boundaries, family obligations, and the importance of transparency in marriage. Samantha defended her decision by explaining Catherine's fragile mental state following her latest business failure and how the stress of potential homelessness might trigger severe depression, anxiety attacks, or worse outcomes that would ultimately cost more in crisis intervention than preventive rent assistance. I explained that my concern wasn't primarily about the monetary amount involved, though $450 monthly represented significant impact on our household budget and long-term savings goals, but rather the lack of transparency and the complete absence of any realistic plan for Catherine to become financially independent or at least partially self-sufficient. This pattern of secretive financial support created fundamental trust issues that extended far beyond the immediate monetary concerns, establishing a dangerous precedent where family emergencies automatically trumped marital communication, joint decision-making processes, and the financial agreements we'd established when deciding to combine our lives and resources. Diana's crises escalated in both frequency and severity throughout that first year of marriage, evolving from relatively minor issues like needing gas money to reach job interviews or temporary childcare assistance during work shifts, to major emergencies involving her children's unexpected medical expenses, threatened vehicle repossessions, and eviction notices that required immediate large payments to prevent disaster. Her romantic relationships provided temporary stability when new boyfriends offered financial support, housing assistance, or childcare help, but these arrangements invariably collapsed within months due to her financial dependency, emotional volatility, or the boyfriend's realization that they were being used primarily for economic support rather than genuine partnership. Each relationship failure left Diana more desperate than before and increasingly dependent on Samantha's intervention to prevent complete financial collapse, creating a pattern where our household budget became the safety net for her poor decision-making and inability to maintain stable adult relationships. The pattern became predictable enough that I started anticipating the timing of crisis calls based on Diana's social media activity patterns, watching for posts about relationship troubles, workplace conflicts, or ominous references to upcoming challenges, while observing Samantha's stress levels increase as she mentally prepared for the next financial emergency request that would strain our resources and create household tension. Catherine's situation deteriorated in parallel as her part-time retail position ended when the store closed permanently due to declining sales, leaving her dependent entirely on occasional house-sitting gigs that paid minimal amounts and Samantha's increasingly substantial assistance to cover basic living expenses like rent, utilities, and groceries. Her apartment complex had notably relaxed management standards that attracted other tenants with similar financial instability and personal problems, creating a volatile environment where minor disputes over noise violations, parking spaces, or shared laundry facilities escalated into building-wide conflicts that somehow always seemed to involve threats of eviction, demands for additional security deposits, or accusations of lease violations that required expensive legal consultation or immediate compliance payments. The emotional manipulation tactics both women employed were sophisticated and remarkably consistent, framing every crisis as a temporary setback that required immediate family support while simultaneously implying that questioning their requests, suggesting alternatives, or asking for accountability demonstrated fundamental lack of love, family commitment, or understanding of their unique and supposedly insurmountable challenges. They tag-teamed their appeals with practiced effectiveness, with Catherine focusing on health concerns related to her age, stress-induced medical problems, and vulnerability to crime in her neighborhood, while Diana emphasized her children's welfare and the devastating impact that housing instability, food insecurity, or utility shutoffs would have on their education, emotional development, and future opportunities. Samantha found herself caught in an impossible position between loyalty to family members who'd always depended on her emotional strength and financial support throughout her adult life, and her commitment to our marriage and the reasonable financial boundaries we'd agreed upon when deciding to combine our lives and build a future together. The breaking point came when Samantha began pressuring me to add her name to my property deed, claiming that our marriage made the current arrangement fundamentally unfair despite the prenuptial agreement she'd signed willingly after reading every clause with her own attorney present. Her arguments evolved from emotional appeals about trust and partnership to more calculated discussions about equity and shared investment, despite the fact that she'd contributed nothing toward the mortgage payments, property taxes, insurance premiums, or maintenance costs that I'd been handling independently for over a decade. She started researching property law and discovered that some states recognize spousal contributions beyond direct financial payments, mentioning repeatedly how her presence had improved the home's value through decorating, organizing, and general upkeep that any competent adult would provide in their own living space. The frequency of these conversations increased after she attended a brunch with hotel industry colleagues where other wives discussed their real estate holdings and investment portfolios, leaving her feeling inadequate about not having property ownership to contribute to their discussions about market appreciation and tax advantages. I explained repeatedly that the prenup existed specifically to protect assets I'd accumulated before our marriage, and that adding her name to the deed would essentially nullify the legal protection we'd both agreed was necessary and appropriate given my father's cautionary experiences with business partnerships and asset division. Her persistence on this topic created underlying tension that affected our daily interactions, as she began pointing out every small improvement or maintenance task as evidence of her investment in the property's value and her right to formal ownership recognition. The situation escalated dramatically when Diana received an eviction notice for non-payment of rent, owing 3 months of back payments totaling approximately $2,100 plus late fees and legal costs that brought the total amount required to prevent eviction to $2,600. Diana's explanation for the rent delinquency involved a complicated story about her ex-boyfriend who'd promised to help with housing costs before disappearing with money she'd given him for other expenses, though the timeline of events seemed deliberately vague and the financial details didn't align with her previous claims about income and expenses. Samantha immediately began calculating how we could cover the eviction prevention payment using our joint savings account, presenting it as a moral imperative rather than a voluntary choice that required my agreement as co-account holder. I suggested that Diana contact social services for emergency rental assistance, explore payment plan options with her landlord, or consider temporary housing with other family members while she stabilized her employment situation and addressed the underlying financial management issues that had created this predictable crisis. Samantha dismissed these practical alternatives as insufficient and unrealistic, insisting that immediate family intervention was the only viable solution to prevent Diana's children from experiencing homelessness and the associated trauma that might affect their school performance, emotional development, and long-term life prospects. The argument that followed revealed fundamental differences in our approaches to family responsibility and financial decision-making that went far beyond this specific emergency situation. I maintained that consistently rescuing Diana from the consequences of her financial irresponsibility only enabled further poor decisions and prevented her from developing the accountability and planning skills necessary for independent adult living. Samantha countered that family members have moral obligations to support each other during crises, and that my analytical approach to her family's problems demonstrated a cold, calculating personality that prioritized money over human welfare and family bonds. Without consulting me or obtaining my consent as required for large withdrawals from our joint account, Samantha transferred $4,200 to Diana's landlord through electronic payment, covering not only the past due rent and associated fees but also providing an additional month's advance payment to ensure housing stability while Diana supposedly focused on finding better employment. I discovered this unauthorized transaction during my routine weekly review of our banking activity, initially assuming it was an error or fraudulent charge before confirming with the bank that Samantha had initiated the transfer using her account access privileges. Confronting her about this breach of trust and violation of our financial agreements triggered the most serious argument of our marriage, with Samantha defending her decision as necessary emergency action that couldn't wait for lengthy discussions or committee-style decision-making when children's welfare was at stake. She accused me of being controlling and obsessive about money, claiming that my requirement for joint consultation on large expenses was unreasonable micromanagement that treated her like a child rather than an equal partner in our marriage. I explained that the issue wasn't the money itself or even the decision to help Diana, but rather the complete disregard for our agreed-upon financial protocols and the precedent this set for future family emergencies that would inevitably arise given Diana's pattern of crisis creation and dependency. The betrayal of trust represented by her unilateral decision-making convinced me that our marriage had fundamental compatibility issues that couldn't be resolved through compromise or better communication, as she clearly viewed family obligations as superseding marital agreements and financial boundaries. In response to this violation of trust, I immediately separated our finances completely, moving my portion of the joint account to individual accounts while maintaining only a minimal shared account for essential household expenses like utilities and groceries. I also changed my direct deposit to eliminate automatic contributions to our joint savings account, explaining that future financial support for her family would need to come exclusively from her own income and personal savings rather than our combined resources. Samantha's reaction to this financial separation was explosive, accusing me of punishing her for caring about family members and weaponizing money to control her behavior and force compliance with my unreasonable demands for absolute authority over household financial decisions. She claimed that my actions proved her mother's warnings about men who use financial control to dominate their wives were accurate, and that I was revealing my true personality now that she'd challenged my authority over family matters that should be mutual decisions. Her accusations of financial abuse were particularly ironic given that she'd been secretly subsidizing her mother's rent for months while simultaneously demanding access to assets I'd accumulated through years of careful saving and investment before our relationship began. The fundamental disconnect between her sense of entitlement to my premarital assets and her resentment of reasonable financial boundaries created an atmosphere of constant conflict that made normal marital communication nearly impossible. Every conversation about money, family, or future planning became an opportunity for her to relitigate the deed transfer issue or justify her family's endless financial needs as legitimate emergencies that required immediate intervention regardless of their impact on our household budget or long-term financial security. I realized that Samantha viewed our marriage primarily as a mechanism for gaining financial security and property ownership rather than a genuine partnership based on mutual respect, shared values, and compatible life goals. Her increasing resentment toward my refusal to add her name to the deed and her willingness to violate our financial agreements for family members who showed no appreciation or accountability demonstrated that she fundamentally misunderstood the nature of adult relationships and the importance of maintaining boundaries with extended family members whose problems stemmed from poor decision-making rather than temporary misfortune. The situation reached its ultimate crisis point when Catherine lost her studio apartment under circumstances that revealed the true extent of her manipulative behavior and complete disregard for personal responsibility. According to her increasingly dramatic retelling of events, the apartment had become completely uninhabitable due to what she described as serious habitability issues, including persistent plumbing problems that flooded her bathroom regularly, dangerous electrical hazards that caused frequent power outages, and extensive mold growth behind the walls that the negligent landlord absolutely refused to address despite her multiple formal complaints and repeated threats of legal action through tenant rights organizations. She claimed to have documented these alleged problems extensively through photographs, written correspondence, and detailed logs of maintenance issues, while consulting with various tenant advocacy groups and housing authorities about pursuing legal remedies for the landlord's blatant negligence and willful violation of basic housing codes and safety standards. However, when I asked specifically to review this supposed documentation or see evidence of her formal complaints to city housing authorities or health departments, she became increasingly evasive and defensive, claiming that most of her communications with the landlord and his management company had been conducted verbally during heated confrontations, and that she'd been too emotionally stressed and physically overwhelmed by the deteriorating living conditions to properly organize and maintain her written records of the extensive problems. The timeline of her sudden departure from the apartment also raised significant questions about her version of events, as she'd apparently moved out abruptly in the middle of the night without providing proper legal notice to the landlord or attempting to recover her substantial security deposit, which seemed highly unusual behavior for someone who was supposedly the innocent victim of serious landlord negligence and systematic housing code violations that would typically warrant legal action and compensation claims. My growing suspicion that Catherine's elaborate story was largely fabricated self-justification was definitively confirmed when I took the initiative to contact the apartment complex management directly and discovered that she'd actually been formally evicted for chronic non-payment of rent after falling 4 full months behind on her obligations despite receiving the $450 monthly assistance payments from Samantha that should have more than covered her total rent obligation and left surplus for other expenses. The property manager, who was surprisingly forthcoming and professional during our conversation, explained that Catherine had been served with all proper legal notices according to state requirements and given multiple opportunities over several months to bring her account current through payment plans and temporary assistance programs, but had consistently ignored all communication attempts from the management office and never responded to formal eviction proceedings or appeared in housing court to contest the legal action against her tenancy. Most tellingly, there had been absolutely no documentation of any habitability complaints in her tenant file, no formal or informal maintenance requests beyond completely routine issues like burned-out light bulbs and running toilets that were promptly addressed within normal time frames, and no evidence whatsoever of the serious structural, electrical, or environmental problems she described in detail to justify her dramatic departure and subsequent claims of victimization by an unscrupulous landlord. Armed with this concrete information about her mother's deliberate deception and systematic manipulation of the facts surrounding her housing crisis, I naturally expected Samantha to recognize the clear pattern of dishonesty, accountability avoidance, and victim blaming that consistently characterized her family's approach to personal responsibility and crisis management situations. Instead, she immediately dismissed the property manager's factual account as obviously biased and self-serving corporate damage control, insisting that landlords and property management companies routinely lie about tenant problems and eviction circumstances to avoid legal liability and protect their reputations, and that her mother's emotional version of events was inherently more trustworthy than calculated corporate public relations efforts designed to shift blame and minimize responsibility. This willful blindness to obvious deception and her automatic, unquestioning defense of family members regardless of contradictory evidence or logical inconsistencies convinced me that any rational discussion about appropriate boundaries or reasonable accountability expectations was completely impossible, as she would always prioritize family loyalty and emotional solidarity over objective facts, verifiable evidence, or reasonable analysis of clearly problematic behavior patterns. The morning after Catherine's eviction became legally final and she was officially barred from the premises, Samantha calmly informed me over coffee that both her mother and Diana's entire family unit would be moving into our home immediately that afternoon, presenting this major life disruption as an unavoidable humanitarian necessity rather than a significant request requiring my thoughtful consideration and explicit agreement as the property owner, mortgage holder, and equal partner in our marriage. She'd apparently spent the entire previous evening making detailed arrangements for this temporary housing solution that would involve Catherine taking over my home office space where I conducted freelance consulting work and managed our household finances, while Diana and her 3 energetic children would occupy the guest bedroom and shared hallway bathroom, with complex sleeping arrangements involving multiple air mattresses, temporary bedding, and personal belongings that would effectively transform our peaceful, organized home environment into a chaotic, overcrowded boarding house situation with no privacy or quiet spaces. Her tone throughout this announcement was completely matter-of-fact rather than apologetic or consultative, as if she was simply informing me of a decision that had already been finalized through family consultation rather than seeking my permission or discussing alternative solutions that might address the immediate housing crisis without completely destroying our living situation, marriage dynamics, and long-term relationship viability. She explained with apparent logic that Diana's subsidized housing authority maintained lengthy waiting lists for larger apartment units that might take many months or even years to navigate successfully, and that Catherine's immediate housing options were severely limited by her recent eviction record, damaged credit history, and complete inability to provide security deposits, first month's rent, or reliable cosigner agreements that most landlords would require before approving new rental applications for applicants with recent legal judgments and financial instability. The supposed plan, such as it was when pressed for details, involved housing both family groups in our home indefinitely while they theoretically worked toward finding permanent alternative solutions, though absolutely no specific timeline, concrete benchmarks for progress, or realistic expectations for eventual independence were mentioned during her presentation. And our extensive past experience with family financial emergencies suggested strongly that temporary assistance inevitably became permanent dependency without clear expectations, specific deadlines, and firm accountability measures. When I pointed out calmly that our comprehensive prenuptial agreement specifically protected my individual property rights and legal ownership interests, and that housing additional long-term occupants would require my explicit written consent as the sole homeowner and mortgage holder responsible for insurance liability and legal compliance issues, Samantha's immediate response revealed the shocking depth of her sense of entitlement and fundamental disregard for the legal agreements we'd both signed voluntarily with independent legal representation. She argued with obvious irritation that emergency humanitarian situations automatically superseded legal technicalities and contractual obligations, and that any husband who would prioritize abstract property rights and legal formalities over immediate family welfare during genuine crisis situations was clearly demonstrating serious character flaws and moral deficiencies that called into serious question his basic fitness for marriage, family life, and adult relationships in general. Her elaborate argument essentially demanded that I completely abandon the legal protections I'd carefully insisted upon during our engagement period and voluntarily transform my private home into a charity shelter for her extended family's ongoing dysfunction and crisis creation, with absolutely no discussion of reasonable alternative solutions like temporary hotel arrangements paid for through family resources, assistance from other relatives with larger homes or available space, or comprehensive social services support programs specifically designed to address housing emergencies without destroying marriages and family relationships. Rather than engaging in the emotional power struggle she clearly expected to win through manipulation and guilt, I calmly accepted her ultimatum and immediately began making practical arrangements to remove myself from what had become an untenable situation. My response apparently stunned her completely, as she'd obviously anticipated lengthy negotiations, tearful arguments, or eventual capitulation to her demands once she applied sufficient emotional pressure and framed my resistance as evidence of fundamental character defects and moral failings. Instead, I walked directly to our bedroom and began systematically packing my essential belongings, focusing first on important documents, work materials, and personal items that would be needed for extended absence from our home while longer-term arrangements were finalized through proper legal channels. Her immediate reaction was a mixture of shock, disbelief, and rising panic as she realized that her ultimatum strategy had backfired spectacularly, triggering exactly the outcome she'd been threatening but apparently never seriously believed would actually occur despite her dramatic declarations about our fundamental incompatibility and irreconcilable differences. She followed me around the house as I packed methodically, alternating between demanding explanations for my supposedly irrational behavior and insisting that she'd never intended for me to actually leave permanently, claiming that reasonable people could work through family crises without resorting to dramatic gestures that would destroy years of marriage and shared investment in our relationship. I explained calmly that she'd made her position absolutely clear regarding her priorities and expectations, and that I was simply respecting her assessment of our fundamental incompatibility rather than forcing her to compromise her deeply held beliefs about family obligations and moral responsibilities that apparently superseded legal agreements and marital commitments we'd both made voluntarily. Within 2 hours of her ultimatum delivery, I'd loaded my car with immediate necessities and contacted my longtime friend Marcus, who offered his spare bedroom indefinitely while I navigated the complex legal and financial processes involved in dissolving a marriage with significant assets and clear prenuptial protections that would need careful handling by experienced professionals. Marcus had witnessed enough of Samantha's family drama during social gatherings to understand immediately why I was choosing separation over continued enabling of dysfunction that threatened to consume our household completely, and his support during this transition period proved invaluable for maintaining perspective and avoiding second-guessing decisions made under extreme emotional pressure. That evening, I consulted with the family law attorney who'd reviewed my prenuptial agreement during our engagement, confirming that the document remained legally sound and enforceable despite Samantha's attempts to argue that emergency circumstances should override contractual obligations and property protections we'd both agreed were necessary and appropriate. The attorney explained that Samantha's threats to involve family court in property division disputes were essentially empty, as the prenup clearly protected my premarital assets including the house, retirement accounts, and investment portfolio that I'd accumulated through years of disciplined saving and careful financial planning before our relationship began. More importantly, her unilateral decision to house additional family members in my property without consent would actually strengthen my legal position if she attempted to claim any form of adverse possession or equity interest based on improvements or contributions during our marriage. Within 48 hours of Samantha serving her ultimatum about accommodating her family or losing her forever, process servers delivered comprehensive divorce papers to her workplace, triggering an immediate and desperate campaign of tears, apologies, and frantic promises to change that I steadfastly ignored despite the emotional manipulation and guilt tactics she employed with increasing desperation. Her initial reaction was complete denial that I could be serious about ending our marriage over what she characterized as a simple family emergency that required temporary compassion and flexibility rather than permanent relationship destruction over minor disagreements about household arrangements. The divorce papers apparently made the consequences of her ultimatum undeniably real, sparking a series of increasingly panicked phone calls and text messages where she alternated between begging for reconciliation and angrily demanding explanations for my supposedly vindictive and disproportionate response to her reasonable request for family support during a crisis period. She claimed repeatedly that she'd never actually intended to force me to choose between our marriage and her family's needs, insisting that she'd simply been overwhelmed by emergency circumstances and hadn't properly communicated her willingness to explore alternative solutions that might address everyone's concerns while preserving our relationship and household stability. Her promises to change included offers to establish strict boundaries with her family, contribute more substantially to household expenses, and even consider requiring Diana and Catherine to pursue professional counseling or job training as conditions for any future assistance from our household resources. However, these belated concessions felt hollow and manipulative given her previous adamant insistence that questioning her family's needs or suggesting accountability measures demonstrated fundamental character flaws and moral deficiencies that made me unsuitable for marriage and family relationships. Samantha's family immediately launched a coordinated harassment campaign through multiple channels, with Catherine and Diana taking turns calling my work number, sending lengthy emails to my personal accounts, and posting inflammatory social media content that painted me as a cold-hearted villain who'd abandoned his wife during her family's time of greatest need. Catherine's messages were particularly dramatic, describing her homelessness and vulnerability while emphasizing how my selfish actions were directly responsible for an elderly woman's suffering and potential danger on the streets where she might face violence, medical emergencies, or death from exposure due to my heartless prioritization of property ownership over human welfare. Diana's approach focused heavily on her children's welfare, sending photos of them looking sad or confused while describing how my decision to destroy their family's stability would traumatize them permanently and damage their educational progress, emotional development, and future life prospects in ways that would haunt them throughout their adult lives. The most manipulative aspect of their harassment campaign was the simultaneous demand that I continue providing financial support for their various needs despite my separation from Samantha, arguing that previous assistance had created moral obligations and expectations that couldn't be abandoned simply because of marital difficulties that should be resolved through counseling rather than divorce proceedings. They suggested that a truly decent man would maintain financial support for family members who'd become dependent on his assistance, regardless of his relationship status with Samantha, and that cutting off aid during their crisis period proved definitively that I'd never genuinely cared about their welfare but had only provided help to manipulate and control Samantha through financial leverage. Their social media campaign was particularly vicious, sharing carefully edited versions of our story that portrayed me as a wealthy, controlling husband who'd used prenuptial agreements and property ownership to trap his wife in an abusive relationship where she couldn't defend her family's legitimate needs without facing financial punishment and emotional abandonment. They conveniently omitted details about the unauthorized financial transfers, the chronic patterns of crisis creation and dependency, or the complete lack of accountability and progress toward independence despite months of substantial assistance that had strained our household budget and marriage relationship. The harassment escalated to include attempts to contact my employer with complaints about my character and suggestions that someone capable of abandoning family members during emergencies might not possess the moral integrity necessary for professional positions involving financial responsibility and client trust. The divorce proceedings moved with remarkable speed and efficiency due to the ironclad prenuptial agreement and meticulously documented property ownership records that left virtually no room for legal disputes or extended litigation over asset division. Samantha received exactly $31,200 representing her precisely calculated share of the home's fair market appreciation during our 3-year marriage period, an amount determined through professional appraisal services and mathematical formula application rather than emotional arguments about contribution and investment that her attorney initially attempted to pursue through various creative legal theories and precedent claims. Her legal team's ambitious efforts to claim substantially larger settlement amounts based on elaborate arguments about emotional investment, domestic labor contributions, and sweat equity improvements to the property were systematically dismantled by comprehensive bank records, mortgage statements, insurance documentation, and detailed financial records that showed definitively and unambiguously that I had personally paid 100% of all mortgage payments, property taxes, homeowners, insurance premiums, and major maintenance costs including roof repairs, HVAC system replacement, plumbing upgrades, and extensive landscape improvements throughout our entire marriage period without any financial contribution from her personal accounts or income sources. The financial records painted an unambiguous and legally compelling picture of sole financial responsibility for property ownership, acquisition, and maintenance, while Samantha's actual contributions had been limited to routine household tasks, minor decorative changes, and basic domestic activities that any competent adult would naturally perform in their living space without expecting ownership equity or financial compensation for fundamental domestic participation that's considered normal. In adult relationships, her attorney's desperate attempts to argue that her extensive family support obligations had prevented her from contributing more substantially to household expenses and property maintenance were completely undermined by documented evidence of the unauthorized financial transfers and her own recorded statements about viewing our marriage primarily as a mechanism for gaining property ownership and financial security, rather than equal financial partnership based on proportional contribution and shared responsibility for major expenses and long-term investment strategies. The court proceedings revealed additional damaging details about our financial arrangements that further strengthened my legal position while exposing the extent of her financial irresponsibility and sense of entitlement, including comprehensive documentation of Samantha's personal spending patterns that showed substantial expenditures on luxury items, entertainment activities, and family assistance that far exceeded her stated income levels and would have been mathematically impossible without the extensive financial support and expense coverage she'd received through our household arrangement and joint account access. Detailed bank statements demonstrated conclusively that while I'd been covering all major household expenses including mortgage, taxes, insurance, utilities, groceries, and maintenance costs, she'd been spending her own income plus additional substantial amounts from our joint accounts on discretionary purchases and family bailouts that totaled nearly $15,000 beyond her documented salary during our final year of marriage alone, representing a level of financial irresponsibility that would have led to serious debt accumulation or bankruptcy without my subsidization of her basic living expenses. The mathematical impossibility of maintaining her lifestyle without substantial subsidization became glaringly obvious during depositions where she struggled to provide coherent explanations for how she'd maintained expensive clothing purchases, frequent salon treatments, luxury cosmetics, and regular family financial assistance while supposedly contributing fairly to our household budget and building legitimate equity claims to marital property through equal partnership participation. Her personal financial records revealed a consistent pattern of living well beyond her actual means that had been enabled entirely by my coverage of essential expenses, allowing her to treat her own income as discretionary spending money while simultaneously building resentment about not having formal ownership stakes in assets she'd never actually helped purchase, maintain, or improve through direct financial contribution or sweat equity investment. The court granted Samantha exactly 30 calendar days to vacate the premises completely and remove all personal belongings, a reasonable timeline that she immediately began violating through passive-aggressive delay tactics and deliberate complications designed to extend her occupancy and create maximum inconvenience during the transition period while testing the boundaries of legal enforcement. Her behavior during those final weeks revealed the true depths of her vindictiveness and profound sense of entitlement, as she engaged in calculated retaliatory actions that included systematically removing household items she hadn't purchased with her own money, deliberately damaging property through careless and spiteful handling of belongings during the packing process, and taking items like the garage door opener along with various tools and equipment that clearly belonged to the house, rather than personal possessions covered by the divorce settlement agreement. She also attempted to claim ownership of furniture, appliances, and electronic equipment that had been purchased with my credit cards and delivered to my address with my name on purchase receipts, arguing through her attorney that items used during our marriage should be considered joint property regardless of clear purchase documentation, though her legal team quickly abandoned this strategy when presented with comprehensive receipts and payment records that clearly established individual ownership of all contested items. More significantly and vindicatively, she deliberately caused unnecessary complications with utility transfers, mail forwarding, and service account changes that created administrative hassles requiring my personal time and attention to resolve, while simultaneously spreading malicious rumors through our social circle about hidden assets, manipulative financial behavior, and secret offshore accounts that supposedly explained my successful property protection during divorce proceedings and revealed my true greedy character. Her elaborate claims about concealed wealth and international financial manipulation were easily disproven through comprehensive financial disclosure requirements mandated by the court, but the false rumors created temporary social awkwardness and required repeated explanations to mutual friends, professional colleagues, and acquaintances who'd been influenced by her carefully crafted narrative about victimization and abandonment during family crisis situations. Meanwhile, Catherine and Diana's harassment campaign intensified dramatically as they realized that divorce proceedings would permanently eliminate their access to my financial resources and household accommodation, prompting increasingly desperate attempts to maintain their dependency relationship through guilt manipulation, legal threats, and public pressure tactics designed to force continued support through reputation damage and social coercion. Catherine's messages became more frequent and emotionally manipulative, describing her precarious housing situation in increasingly dramatic terms while emphasizing her advancing age, various health vulnerabilities, and complete helplessness without continued financial support from someone with supposed moral obligation to assist family members regardless of legal relationship status or personal boundaries. She claimed repeatedly that previous assistants had created ethical commitments and moral obligations that transcended marital boundaries and legal formalities, arguing that any decent human being would continue supporting elderly relatives who'd become dependent on that help, especially when the alternative involved potential homelessness and dangerous living conditions that might result in serious injury, medical emergencies, or death from exposure to criminal elements in unsafe neighborhoods. Diana's harassment approach evolved to include increasingly specific veiled legal threats about pursuing court action for financial abandonment and emotional distress, claiming that the sudden termination of household support had created severe psychological trauma for her children who'd become emotionally attached to stable housing arrangements and educational continuity that my selfish decisions had destroyed without any consideration for innocent victims who would suffer permanent damage from my vindictive actions. She suggested ominously that family court judges might be very interested in examining my documented pattern of using financial control to manipulate and punish family members, conveniently ignoring or misrepresenting the extensive documentation of voluntary assistance provided over many months without any legal obligation or reasonable expectation of permanent dependency relationships that would continue indefinitely regardless of changed circumstances. 8 months after the divorce became final, I found myself thriving in ways I hadn't experienced since before meeting Samantha, discovering that reclaiming my independence had unleashed energy and focus that had been gradually drained by years of managing family crises and financial manipulation. The most immediate and tangible improvement was adopting Scout, a 3-year-old German Shepherd from the local rescue organization who'd been surrendered by a family that couldn't handle his exercise requirements and protective instincts. Scout transformed my daily routine in positive ways, requiring morning runs that improved my physical fitness and evening walks that helped me decompress from work stress while exploring neighborhood areas I'd never bothered to investigate during my marriage. His presence also provided excellent security for the house and a conversation starter with neighbors who'd previously known me only as the quiet engineer whose wife had family drama that occasionally spilled into public view through loud phone conversations and unexpected visitors. My career experienced significant advancement during this period as well, earning a substantial promotion to senior project manager with oversight responsibilities for major infrastructure developments that came with both increased salary and professional recognition from colleagues who'd noticed my improved focus and renewed enthusiasm for challenging technical problems. The promotion represented validation of my professional competence and leadership potential that had been somewhat overshadowed during my marriage by the constant stress of managing household financial crises and family emergencies that had affected my concentration and long-term career planning. Without the emotional drain of ongoing family manipulation and financial uncertainty, I could invest mental energy in professional development activities like advanced certification programs and industry conferences that enhanced my technical skills and expanded my professional network in meaningful ways. Meanwhile, Samantha's carefully constructed public narrative about being abandoned by a controlling husband began falling apart as mutual friends and former colleagues witnessed her family's entitled behavior and manipulative tactics firsthand during subsequent social interactions and crisis situations. The mask of victimization became increasingly difficult to maintain when people observed Diana's continued pattern of job instability and crisis creation, Catherine's obvious sense of entitlement and refusal to pursue available assistance programs, and Samantha's own bitter resentment toward anyone who questioned her version of events or suggested personal accountability measures. Several former colleagues from her hotel management position reported that she'd been complaining about her family's financial drain and irresponsible behavior for years before our divorce, contradicting her current portrayal of them as innocent victims deserving unlimited support and protection from heartless relatives who prioritized money over family welfare. These revelations created cognitive dissonance for people who'd initially sympathized with her situation, leading them to reconsider the dynamics of our marriage and the circumstances surrounding our separation with more skeptical and analytical perspective. The most telling validation of my position came from unexpected sources, including neighbors who revealed that they'd frequently witnessed Catherine and Diana's entitled behavior during their visits to our house, describing incidents where they'd made demands about parking arrangements, complained about noise levels from adjacent properties, and generally acted as if they owned or had special rights to my property and neighborhood resources. One neighbor mentioned observing Diana's children playing unsupervised in my backyard while she remained inside making lengthy phone calls, treating my private property as an extension of her own living space without permission or consideration for boundaries that most adults respect automatically. Former work colleagues who'd met Samantha at professional events began sharing their own observations about her constant complaints regarding my supposed financial control and property ownership issues, noting that her resentment seemed disproportionate to her actual contributions to our household and inconsistent with her apparent lifestyle expectations that far exceeded her individual earning potential. These conversations revealed that many people had noticed troubling patterns in her behavior and attitude but had felt uncomfortable commenting during our marriage, preferring to avoid involvement in what appeared to be private family dynamics and personal relationship issues. The broader vindication extended to professional relationships where my reputation for integrity and sound decision-making had been temporarily questioned by the harassment campaign and rumor-spreading efforts, but was ultimately strengthened when colleagues observed the contrast between my consistent professional behavior and the increasingly desperate and irrational actions of people attempting to damage my reputation through false accusations and emotional manipulation. My engineering firm's partners explicitly acknowledged that the personal attacks I'd endured had actually demonstrated my character and judgment under pressure, leading to increased confidence in my ability to handle complex projects and sensitive client relationships that required discretion and emotional stability. The financial benefits of reclaiming my independence became apparent through rapid accumulation of savings and investment opportunities that had been impossible while subsidizing extended family dysfunction and crisis management. Within 6 months, I'd rebuilt my emergency fund to comfortable levels and increased my retirement contributions substantially while maintaining a higher standard of living than I'd enjoyed during marriage, demonstrating conclusively that the financial strain in our household had been entirely attributable to supporting people who had no intention of becoming self-sufficient or acknowledging the sacrifices required to maintain their dependency. Scout's presence also provided unexpected social benefits as dog ownership connected me with other responsible pet owners in the community, leading to friendships and social activities that were based on shared interests and mutual respect rather than obligation and crisis management that had characterized my relationship with Samantha's extended family network. These new relationships were refreshingly straightforward and reciprocal, involving people who contributed positively to each other's lives rather than creating constant emergencies and demands for assistance that never resulted in meaningful progress or appreciation. The contrast between healthy adult relationships and the toxic dependency patterns I'd escaped became increasingly obvious as I observed how normal people handled financial challenges, family obligations, and personal setbacks without expecting others to sacrifice their own security and stability to enable continued poor decision-making and accountability avoidance. Perhaps most importantly, I'd learned to distinguish between genuine partnership based on mutual respect and shared responsibility versus manipulation disguised as love that relied on guilt, obligation, and emotional blackmail to extract resources and concessions from people who made the mistake of caring about someone's welfare more than they cared about their own long-term security and happiness. The peace and stability I'd regained confirmed that my father's warnings about protecting assets and maintaining boundaries weren't about being selfish or materialistic, but rather about ensuring that generosity and support were directed toward people who valued those gifts and used them constructively rather than treating them as entitlements that should continue indefinitely regardless of behavior or outcomes. Looking back on the entire experience, I realized that Samantha's ultimatum had actually been a gift that forced me to choose between enabling destructive patterns and reclaiming my right to build a life based on my own values and goals rather than constantly sacrificing those priorities to manage other people's crises and emotional demands that would never be satisfied no matter how much support was provided.